In July 1979, Glenna Susan Sue Sharpney Davis, born March 29, 1945 in Springfield, Massachusetts, along with her 5 children, left her home in Connecticut after divorcing her husband James Sharp. They moved to Northern California, where Sue's brother Don lived. After some searching for relocation options, Glenna chose the tiny town of Keddie in the Sierra Nevada mountains. By 2010, there were only 66 people living there, and before that there were only a few more. All the local families knew each other well, and for Glenna and her children, this place was supposed to be the beginning of their new and happy lives. But instead, 3 of the Sharp family found only a terrible death here, and this massive unsolved murder called the Keddie murder is still the most famous event in this settlement. Upon arrival in California, she rented a small trailer, previously occupied by her brother, at the Claremont Trailer Village in Quincy. The following fall, she moved into house number 28 in the rural railroad town of Keddie in the Sierra Nevada. The house was much larger than a trailer and became available when Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas vacated the property. She lived there with her 15-year-old son John, born November 16, 1965, 14-year-old daughter Sheila, 12-year-old daughter Tina, born July 22, 1968, and 2 younger sons, Rick 10 years old and Greg 5 years old. The family gradually began to settle in a new place. Glenna met the neighbors and they had a good relationship. On April 11, 1981, around 11:30 a.m., Sue, Sheila, and Greg left the home of their friends, the Meeks family, to pick up Rick, who was attending baseball tryouts at Ganster Field in Quincy. They came across John and Dana Hall Wingate, born February 8, 1964, who were hitchhiking at the mouth of the canyon from Quincy to Keddie, and then drove them about 6 miles, 9.7 km, to Keddie. 2 hours later, around 3:30 p.m., John and Dana hitchhiked back to Quincy, where they may have had plans to visit friends. Around the same time, the boys were seen in the city center. That evening, Sheila planned to spend the night with the Sibold family, who lived in the neighboring house, No. 27, while Sue stayed at home with Rick, Greg, and the boys' young friend Justin Smart. Sheila left No. 28 shortly after 8 p.m. to spend the night with the Sibolds. At about 8 a.m. on April 12th, Sheila returned to house No. 28 and found the corpses of Sue, John, and Dan in the living room of the house. The whole house was covered in blood, and in this blood lay the dead bodies of her mother, her brother John, and his friend Dan. All of them were tightly bound with band-aids, as well as wires from an extension cord, lamps from the girls' room, and brutally beaten, and then stabbed with 2 knives and hammered. The murder weapons were found at the crime scene. Rick, Greg, and Justin were alive in the next room, but 12-year-old Tina was not among the dead or among the survivors. Upon discovering the scene, Sheila rushed back to the Sibold house, and Jamie Sibold took Rick, Greg, and Justin through the bedroom window. He later admitted that he briefly entered the house through the back door to see if anyone was alive, which could potentially spoil the evidence in the process. The murders of Sue, John, and Dan were particularly brutal. 2 bloody knives and 1 hammer were found at the scene. Traces of blood inside the house indicated that all the murders took place in the living room. Sue was found lying on her side near the sofa in the living room, naked from the waist down with a gag in her mouth, gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear, which was secured with a band-aid. She was stabbed in the chest and her throat was cut horizontally. The wound passed through the larynx and grazed the spine, and there was an imprint on the side of her head corresponding to the butt of a Daisy 880 Powerline air rifle. John's throat was cut. Dan had multiple head injuries and was manually strangled to death. John and Dan suffered blunt force trauma to their heads caused by 1 or more hammers. An autopsy revealed that Sue and John died from stab wounds and blunt force trauma, and Dan died of suffocation. When the police arrived at the scene, they confessed that they had never seen such a brutal murder. A woman and teenagers were tortured with a knife before their deaths, and they were killed with such ferocity that even the walls and furniture were splattered with blood. John was beaten on the head, and then his throat was cut, and his friend Dane was lying next to him, and was like John with his ankles tied with a wire. Moreover, he was additionally tied with his feet to John's feet. There was a deep indentation wound on his head from a strong blow, but he died of strangulation. Glenna Sue was stripped almost naked, and her mouth was gagged with her own underwear and wrapped with a band-aid. It was clear from the injuries on her arms that she was trying to defend herself and died from severe hammer blows and cuts to her throat. There was literally no living place on her body. The curtains of the house were tightly drawn over the windows. The phone was torn from the bedside table, and traces of blood were found even inside the victim's shoes. The missing girl, Tina, could not be found, and it was unclear what had become of her. Outrage and public rejection was caused by the fact that the surviving children apparently slept soundly in the next room, while their mother and brother brutally tortured and killed through a thin wall from them. None of the residents of the neighboring houses standing next to each other also saw or heard anything that night. No screams or other noise. Sheila didn't hear anything either, being at a friend's house next door. At the same time, the victims were tortured and killed for at least an hour. The motive for the murder remained unclear to the end. It was not an assault with the aim of rape or robbery. The police believed that the main target was Glenna Sharp, and perhaps she was being avenged for something. Indirect evidence of this was the murder of her son John in front of her. Dane was killed more as a witness in the kidnapping of Tina. However, for what reason the Avengers did not touch the younger children in the other room at all, it remains unknown. Sheila and the Sibold family, with whom Sheila spent the night in the house next door, did not hear any noise at night. The couple living in the house next door, no. 16 were woken up at 1:15 a.m. by something like a muffled scream. Martin Smart, a neighbor, and the main suspect, claimed that a jackhammer had inexplicably disappeared from his house. In addition to interviewing the Smarts, detectives interviewed numerous other local residents and neighbors. Some, including members of the Sibold family, recalled seeing a green van parked outside the Sharps' home around 9 p.m. The original sketches of the two suspects, based on the testimony of Justin, who claimed to have witnessed the crimes. Justin told contradictory stories about that evening and claimed that he had dreamed about the details of the murders. In his later account of the events narrated under hypnosis, he claimed to have seen Sue with two men. Based on Justin's descriptions, the sketches of the two unknown men were made by Harlan Embry, a man with no artistic abilities and no training in forensic sketching. It has never been explained why, with access to the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI), leading forensic specialists, law enforcement agencies decided to use an amateur who sometimes volunteered to help local police. In press releases accompanying the sketches, the suspects were described as people between the ages of 20 and 31, was 5 feet 11 inches to 6 feet 2 inches tall with dark blonde hair, and the other was 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall with black greased hair. Both were wearing gold-rimmed sunglasses. Rumors that the crimes were ritual or motivated by drug trafficking were refuted by Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas, who stated a week after the murders that no drug paraphernalia or illegal drugs were found in the house. Tina's disappearance was initially investigated by the FBI as a possible abduction, although on April 29, 1981, it was reported that the FBI had abandoned the search because the California Department of Justice was doing an adequate job and made the FBI presence unnecessary. With the help of police dogs, an area was searched within a 5-mile, 8.0 km radius around the house, but the efforts were unsuccessful. On April 11, 1984, a bottle collector discovered the cranial part of a human skull and part of a lower jaw at Camp 18 near Feather Falls in neighboring Butte County, about 5 miles, 8.0 kilometers from Feather Falls, California. A forensic pathologist confirmed that the remains belonged to Tina in June 1984. Shortly after the discovery was announced, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous call in which it was determined that the remains belonged to Tina, but this call was not documented. The tape recording of the call was found at the bottom of the evidence box at some point after 2013 by the deputy sheriff assigned to the case. According to a 2016 article published by the Sacramento Bee, Martin left Keddie and drove to Reno, Nevada, shortly after the murders. While there, he sent Marilyn a letter reflecting on the personal struggles in their marriage, concluding which he stated, "I paid the price for your love, and now I've bought it with the lives of 4 people." In a 2016 interview, Gamberg stated that the letter was overlooked during the initial investigation and was never accepted as evidence. He later criticized the quality of the initial investigation, saying, "You could have hired someone who had just graduated from the academy, and they would have done a better job." The consultant, whom Martin regularly visited, also claimed that he confessed to the murders of Sue and Tina. but claimed I had nothing to do with the boys. He allegedly told the consultant that Tina was killed to prevent her from identifying him as she witnessed all this. Bobby, who allegedly had links to organized crime in Chicago, died there in 1988. On March 24, 2016, a hammer matching the description of the one Martin claimed he had lost was found in a local pond and was taken as evidence by Plumas County Special Investigator Mike Gamberg. Plumas County Sheriff Hagwood, who was 16 years old at the time of the murders and knew the Sharp family, said the place where it was found, it would have been placed there intentionally. It wouldn't have been accidentally lost. Gamberg also stated that 6 potential suspects were being questioned at the time. In April 2018, Gamberg stated that DNA evidence found on a piece of tape at the crime scene matched the DNA of a known living suspect. When they started looking for fingerprints, they found nothing. The killers used gloves. Biological materials were found, but it was 1981, and there was still a long way to go before mass DNA testing by the police. Then several potential suspects appeared. First of all, Justin Easen's stepfathers Martin Smart and his neighbor Joe Bowe with a criminal record. Smart stated that it was probably his hammer that was found in the Sharps' house, but someone stole it from him shortly before the murder. There was no other evidence against Smart, and he was released. The case was declared unsolved. And 3 years later, Tina Sharp was found missing. More precisely, what's left of it. On April 22, 1984, a child's skull was found in a neighboring county, in a place 100 miles from the town of Keddie. Along with the skull, several other skeletal bones, a blanket, children's jeans with a torn pocket, a blue jacket, and an empty roll of sticky tape lay on the ground in the thicket. Shortly after the gruesome discovery, an anonymous person called the police and stated that the skull found was the remains of Tina Sharp. After that, a special DNA test was conducted, and it turned out that the words of the anonymous person were correct. However, the discovery of the girl's skull also did not move investigators one step closer to solving the murder in Keddie. How Tina Sharp died and what results the study of her remains showed did not get into the press. It was only indicated that the bones were badly gnawed by forest predators. Later, journalists discovered striking similarities between the murder of Tina Sharp and the murder of another teenage girl in the same state in 1973. Both Tina and that girl were found in an abandoned area in the form of bone remains. Both Tina and that girl's lower jaw were posthumously smashed into several pieces by strong hammer blows. This coincidence could indicate the work of a serial killer. Until 2013, the Sharps case was sealed and reopened only when Special Investigator Mike Gamberg and County Sheriff's Deputy Greg Hagwood decided to take over the case. They found a box on this old case at the police station and decided to recheck all the facts. True, this new investigation also did not lead to anything new, except new suspicions about Martin Smart. But he died back in 2000 and it was already impossible to interrogate him. And the Sharp house was demolished back in 2004.